everybody, and welcome back to Crypto Social Analytics. Today, we're going to go over basically a comparison of the United States economy and what we believe its prospects are in the coming, between 2 to 5, maybe up to 10 years, and then compare, the U.S. economy against China. We kind of see as a result of kind of some of the policy making over the past few years, what we think might be the best economy. So, first chart we're going to look at today is just a basic GDP growth over time. So, I think it's pretty evident from this chart that, starting in kind of the mid 2000s, of course, China's growth rate, dramatically accelerated and has been outpacing the U.S. significantly. So, it's pretty obvious just from the slope of this line that, it looks like China is outpacing the U.S., with GDP growth. The next chart we'll take a look at is debt to GDP. So this is again from the OECD. We see that the U.S. has right now 150% of its GDP is debt, which is a pretty high number. Again, you see Greece, Italy, Japan. Then you see next to the US, a lot of European countries, France, Portugal, UK, Spain, Belgium, even Canada's, quite a bit up there. So that is a pretty significant debt to GDP ratio. You take a look at China. China is much less. In 2021, they're expected debt to GDP is 73%. So, that's less than half the US, which you have to think, just based on that alone, China has a lot more breathing room for fiscal policy in terms of, they can basically lower rates and, stimulate and don't have to contract their balance sheet necessarily. So that should give them quite an advantage in terms of economic growth over the U.S. in the years to come. And again, you look at too, it's interesting, the projections of this chart, the increase, who knows with the projections, they could be not very accurate, but the projections, I guess they're kind of projecting a 2 to 5% increase in debt to GDP each year. And you look at the US, they really have been increasing pretty rapidly for the past few years. So then we can go take a look at GDP growth rate of the US. And, so in 2021, they came in at about 6%. The current projections for 2022 are 5.2%. Then it's expected to drop off to 2 and then 1.7% for the next few years after that. China came in at 8% for 2021. So, again, about 2% higher than the US. Then they're expected to be around, I guess, 4.37 here, but also a lot of people are kind of consensusly saying about 5% GDP growth for this year. And then China is expected to kind of stay around about the 5% range for the next few years. So, first of all, the projections could be off, and probably for the US are likely too optimistic given the debt burden. But even with that, the current projections are US is going to be growing about 2% a year, China's going to be growing about 5% a year. So, that's a pretty significant gap in terms of growth rates of GDP. And the other thing is, we can kind of take a look at the US inflation rate from the CPI. And the numbers came in at 8.3% this month, which is pretty high. You come take a look at China. China's at about 2%. So, again, just much less inflation. So, a lot more breathing room in terms of expansionary, monetary policy. Then we can take a look at some of the stimulus packages for different large economies that were provided in 2020 and 2021. And, again, Japan, wow, 53.69% of its GDP was stimulus. That's pretty extreme. I didn't even realize that. And then US 26.46%, China only 4.7% of its GDP was dedicated for stimulus. So again, just like a huge differential between US and China, Japan and China, and then the European countries like Germany was 34.81% of GDP was put into stimulus. Just huge differentials between those. And interestingly too, Russia only 4.8% of GDP was put into stimulus. So you have to think that those countries that put less money into stimulus, I mean, now it's going to be an advantage for them as they don't have to essentially pay off all that debt. So that's kind of another factor that might probably will weigh in China's favor. You look at population growth rates, the US and China are growing at about the same rate. Really, US 0.4% growth in 2020, China 0.3% growth. Population distribution is fairly similar between the two countries in terms of the different generations that we have. And then, what's interesting too is kind of some of this strategic activity that's going on. The US and Europe are kind of battling against maybe China and Russia to influence different regions of the world. It's interesting. The US had this ASEAN summit, I believe it was this week, and they're offering, $150 million to kind of partner with some of these ASEAN countries. And then what's interesting, is this One Belt, One Road initiative. It really seems like it at least has been making some substantial progress with partnering with some different, with China partnering with some different countries. So if you take a look at this chart, I think it's pretty interesting. You see that China has gained, has basically partnered with other countries for infrastructure projects in, several countries in Asia, Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, Mongolia, Indonesia, and then in Afghanistan, Pakistan, in the Middle East as well, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and then a lot in Eastern Europe as well, Poland, Belarus, Romania, Serbia, Turkey, even Italy, and then quite substantially in Africa as well, Nigeria, South Africa, many different countries in Africa, and then also in South America too, Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, Chile. So, really it seems like China has been making some substantial progress in forming relationships especially with some of these countries that will probably emerge, as economically growing countries and become, powers in the years to come. Because, a lot of these other countries like Japan, Australia, and Europe have just declining populations, and maybe not Australia, but their GDP growth rate is pretty low. So, yeah, definitely. To me, I would say to sum everything up, it seems that China is far more likely to outgrow the US and probably on average have better returns than the US um, in the years to come, just because much less debt, much higher growth. They're making some good strategic moves and they just have much more financial leverage, and will essentially be able to outspend the US in years to come because they're going to have a greater GDP growth and less debt holding them back. So, yeah, that would be my synopsis of the difference between these two countries. Although no doubt US will still likely remain a substantial player, of course, in the global economy. So, all right. Well, I hope everyone has an excellent day, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you. Bye.